welcome everyone to this really, for me personally, a very important webinar on strengthening the Global Plastic Treaty. My name is Antoinette Vermilye, and I'm from the Gallifrey Foundation, and I'm here to moderate this event. I think it's important to note that the central aim of this webinar is to foster an environment that supports a successful outcome to the second part of the fifth session of the International Negotiating Committee, INC 5.2, which will become mute. I keep being muted. I don't know why. But anyway, so the aim is that hopefully this will become COPS. It'll be easier to pronounce. What we're going to do is focus mainly on marine plastic pollution as a lens to understand the urgency of upstream action, the role of international law, and the tools needed to ensure implementation and accountability. We have three panelists today. First, Christina Dixon from the Environmental Investigation Agency, and she's going to provide a strategic overview. She's basically followed this whole treaty negotiation from the beginning till now, putting it all in context, the current state of negotiations, and what's needed for a treaty that can deliver meaningful change across the plastics life cycle. Then we're going to be followed by Giuseppe Sernia from UNODC, and he'll speak about the international criminal law and how its future developments could enable enforcement for illegal plastic waste management. And finally, we're going to have Dr. Anna von Rebay from Ocean Vision Legal, and she is here to explain the binding obligations states already have under UNCLOS and human rights law, and how these legal duties strengthen the case for adopting a robust plastic treaty. So these perspectives aim to equip you and stakeholders with clear, actionable insights as we head into INC 5.2 in Geneva in August. So let's begin. I will now introduce Christina. She is our first panelist. She is amazing. She leads the ocean program at the Environmental Investigation Agency, and she brings decades of experience in ocean and plastics governance with a deep involvement in key international processes ranging from the early UNEA sessions, as I mentioned earlier, to where we are now, the current Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. Her expertise spans both policy and legal measures, and a particular focus on reducing the environmental and human health impacts of plastic production and consumption. So, Christina, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Antoinette. And yeah, I don't know why introduction's always so mortifying, but it's a very, very nice introduction. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my screen right now. So yeah, I'm just going to take you on a sort of 10-minute whirlwind journey of the Plastics Treaty negotiations, how we got here and where we are now. And I'm really happy actually to see there's a bunch of treaty heads also on this call. So feel free to compliment anything I say with ideas or reflections in the chat, because everyone has like a different take on what's been happening so far. And apologies, I've had a cold for about 2 weeks, which I think I've finally kicked, but I have occasional frogs in my throat, so I'm gonna do my best. But I'll just kick off. So just for context, as I'm sure you're all aware, plastic pollution over the last few decades has become a ubiquitous part of our daily life. Plastics are literally everywhere. The top right picture is a satellite image of fields of agroplastics in Spain through which food is being grown. But we have plastics being used sort of in every aspect of our daily lives. And the top left image is just to illustrate how the amount of plastics that we're producing and consuming have become so expansive that we're structurally dependent on exporting plastic waste, for example, from the global north to countries in Asia, because we do not have waste management systems that can handle what we're producing and using at the moment. So over the last few years, there's been recognition that we need some kind of legal framework to address the production, use and disposal of plastics because the sort of patchwork of national regulation wasn't working. Plastic production has increased exponentially since the 1950s, and actually most of the plastic that has ever been produced was produced since the year 2000. And on the current growth trajectory, we're seeing that plastic production is likely to double by 2040. So we are on a treadmill of plastic production, which currently is not being addressed in any meaningful way through international law or indeed national law. And more than that, we're also seeing that plastics are now being inherently linked to a global health crisis. So there's been a substantial body of evidence looking at the presence of chemicals of concern in plastics and the lack of information about those chemicals that are being used in plastics and how they are linked to, for example, fertility issues, developmental disorders, and even cancers. So we have kind of hand in hand an environmental crisis and a health crisis that needs to be addressed. So over about the last decade or so, we've seen big growing momentum to do something about this problem. We know it's a problem, the science is there, but what do we do about it? We've seen the business coalition kind of coalescing around a vision for some kind of global legal framework that could kind of harmonize and level the international business playing field. We've had the scientific community issue multiple calls for action. We've had civil society growing in huge numbers, building around a sort of vision for a plastics treaty that could address this. And this sort of culminated in a proposal from Rwanda and Peru in 2022 to initiate negotiations for a new plastics treaty. So the plastics treaty often is sort of said, well, the reason we haven't succeeded yet is because it's been a very fast negotiation. And that is true, but this process to negotiate a new plastics treaty, it didn't come from nowhere. The UN Environment Assembly, otherwise known as UNEA, is the global environmental decision-making body. And under UNEA, there were successive resolutions. So resolutions being where countries get together and they sort of commit to a sort of set of language which recognizes and calls for action on specific problems. And marine litter and microplastics started emerging in around 2014 within the UNEA framework, countries increasingly concerned about this problem. And in 2017, initiated an ad hoc expert working group to start building this evidence base. And that led to, looking at this evidence base, looking at the problem we're facing, it led to the UNEA 5 resolution called 514, which kicked off negotiations for a treaty. So, and in this picture, you can see this is the chair of the UNEA banging a recycled plastic gavel. This was a huge moment, historic landmark environmental decision-making moment to actually negotiate a new treaty. So what is the INC, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, and what is it going to do? So it's a committee basically comprised of all of the member states, but also observers like EIA and many people on this call, also the scientific community and many others. And the governments are negotiating a new legally binding global instrument on plastics. And it looks at plastic pollution in all environments, including microplastics. And the scope of the negotiations covers everything from the kind of production of plastics. So can we, set a target to reduce how much plastics are being produced? Can we have legally binding requirements on product design, for example? What about waste management? What about the remediation of existing plastic pollution in the environment? And quite fundamentally, what kind of technical and financial assistance is going to be made available to support member states, particularly developing countries, in implementing any obligations that they commit to at the global level under this new treaty? Quite importantly as well, my favorite line in the UNEA resolution is also this line, which says that the INC can consider anything else that it deems relevant. So pretty much everything is in scope for discussion. So if we get new information about something related to plastics that we think is important, states are also encouraged to talk about those things as well. The idea was that we were going to conclude negotiations by the end of 2024. But as you can see, we're having this conversation in 2025 and the negotiations have not concluded. So how did we get here? We've basically had 5 rounds of the INC. So INC 5 was in Busan, South Korea at the end of last year. And what happened was basically there was no agreement on the final text. So negotiations reached a sort of like loggerheads. There was no way that we were going to conclude the treaty. So the chair of the INC suspended the session and that became 5.1. and the session is resuming. So as if we never went anywhere, but thankfully we did. We've had a few months off. We'll get back together in Geneva in August to hopefully conclude the negotiations. And after that, there would be a period of ratification. States would commit to implementing the treaty, joining the treaty, and it would enter into force. And then we go into having Conference of the Parties, otherwise known as COPs, to sort of start really doing the work. So it's a very long process, but it does provide a very strong legal foundation to governing plastics across the life cycle and in all environments, including the human body. So it's pretty massive. So what's happened at the INCs? Well, everything and nothing. So we don't have a legal text, so nothing is agreed until everything has been agreed, but there has been substantial development of text. So at some point we had a text that was, I think it was like 70 pages long, 3,000 brackets in it, and it covered really everything you could ever think of related to plastics. And that's been kind of gradually whittled down to the point where now the basis for negotiations is a text that's been prepared by the chair of the INC, Luis Valles of Ecuador. And that text is a kind of distilled version of everything that's been discussed so far. And there's been some really big wins. So for example, I mentioned health. Health wasn't really a prominent feature of the UNEA 514 resolution, but throughout the negotiations, health has really come into focus and has become a key part of these negotiations, to the extent that an objective of the instrument is likely to be to protect human health and the environment from plastic pollution. So there's been kind of a big kind of broadening of our understanding of the need to address plastic production, to address chemicals of concern, and that we need a substantial financial architecture to deliver on this. But at the same time, we have experienced kind of obstruction. So a small group of countries who don't want us to have a treaty at all, I suspect. And if they do agree to a treaty, it's likely to be a very weak one with a narrow scope that's purely focused on waste management, which is important, but not enough. This really came to a head in Paris, actually. So INC 2, which was essentially probably the worst INC, if I could rank them. I haven't really created a definitive ranking because it's not finished yet, but when I do, Paris wasn't a good one. And this was pretty much because there was an issue around the rules of procedure. So negotiations function based on agreed rules of operation. And those rules of procedure for this negotiation were only provisionally applied. So the rules exist but don't exist. And so this actually culminated in a big debate amongst countries. The negotiations imploded when the rules of procedure came into question. And there's a big debate about the right to vote. So whether this treaty can be agreed through consensus or whether there's the possibility to vote if necessary. And because a sort of very delicate truce was negotiated within the context of Paris, it meant that negotiations were sort of left a little bit fragile, and everybody is now afraid to kind of open the Pandora's box of Paris and rules of procedure. So that's something that's kind of cast a shadow over the negotiations. Just to kind of wrap up where we are now. So basically, kind of with all of that context that I've provided, heading into 5.1, you had a kind of big group of ambitious countries who were quite frustrated with the sort of stalemate that we faced in the negotiations. These countries became like loosely called the 100 plus. So it's countries that are in the High Ambition Coalition plus some others who've kind of had enough. So there were some big sort of media moments, press conferences with the Pacific Islands, Panama, the EU, really kind of saying, we've had enough. We're holding this line of ambition. We need a treaty that's meaningful, that addresses the root causes of plastic pollution. And we're not going to compromise just to get this across the line. And we're not going to kind of bow to the pressure of countries that don't want a meaningful treaty. There was a huge moment in the closing plenary where Rwanda issued a statement on behalf of 85 countries called the Stand Up for Ambition Statement. And that led to a kind of standing ovation in plenary where people said, people were kind of committing to this idea that we need these meaningful measures and we need a financial system that can deliver this. And that's kind of the minimum, the baseline of an effective treaty. So the question now is whether the momentum of that 100 plus countries can be carried forward into 5.2 and that we can agree a treaty that is kind of capable of addressing plastic pollution across the life cycle and in the human body. And that is a big question mark. There are a lot of contentious issues. The geopolitical landscape has significantly changed since 5.1. I'm sure I don't need to kind of explain that to you. So we're operating in a different world than we were at the end of last year. But there is still a core group of countries who think that achieving a legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution is still possible. So I guess the role for us as stakeholders, observers, as well as scientific and business community is to kind of help push that needle of ambition and bring this across the line. So that was a whirlwind tour of the Plastics Treaty. I hope that wasn't an overload of information, but I'm really happy to answer questions in the chat as well, or later on if there's time. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Christina. That is amazing. It's almost like a movie. You can almost see everything and people huddling, the stress, excitement. And yes, there's a lot that is at stake right now. I noticed that you mentioned, the health and environmental impacts of the plastic pollution, but now we're going to talk to Giuseppe because there's also the social justice. A lot of, as you said, all this plastic that's produced, where does it go? Giuseppe Sernia is a maritime law expert with a background as an Italian Navy officer and legal advisor in UN missions. Since 2015, he served as regional coordinator for the UNODC Global Maritime Crime Program, and he's been leading the work in West Africa and now coordinating UNODC's efforts across the Mediterranean, Black and Caspian Seas. He holds 2 LLMs in maritime law from the universities of Southampton and Bologna, and he brings critical insights into the intersection of law enforcement, maritime security, and environmental protection. And this is really important. This is an important part of another side, another facet of the Plastics Treaty. Giuseppe, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. So first point is that, my background is a Navy officer. I was a Navy officer doing also law enforcement work in our deployment, and many defense institutions have what they call dual role. So the military defense one, but also the roles which go beyond the defense, and the environmental law is also one of them, like law enforcement is. Now, in the legal conversation on plastic pollution, as much as legal conversation on all the maritime environmental protection, there is a certain approach which has been evolving through the years. We look a lot at the primary norm. We don't look much at the secondary one. And let me go deeper into the difference between primary and secondary. If we look into the concept of, philosophy of law, older elaborations, primary is the regulatory aspect, you shall not. Secondary norm is what happens if you don't do what is the regulation. And in the environmental protection, maritime environmental protection, we have a lot of tendencies toward creating regulatory frameworks. We don't have much on compliance. And that's where really, in my reading, the gap is the compliance. We are really able to regulate, often able to regulate. We are not much able to ensure compliance with what we regulate. And that's also the problem with MPAs. No? We look at MPAs, we look at paper parks, parks which are beautiful in their conception, but then when we look into complying with those regulations, we miss the spot. And that's also what we see in the maritime space, and what we will also see, we do see on the plastic pollution aspects, and we also see it in the evolution of the ILC, and the Plastic Treaty, a strong tendency toward the regulatory framework. But then how much can we actually work on compliance, and specifically, how much can we work on compliance of those major offenses, those major cases of pollution? Let me think at some specific cases, some related to plastic, some not. The Express Pearl, the case in Sri Lanka, you may remind the big case in Sri Lanka. That case, we had a large amount of plastic pellet, basically microplastic for industrial production. And this large amount of microplastic was polluting the coastline of Sri Lanka, creating a biodiversity damage, a massive biodiversity damage, which is not only limited to the maritime space of Sri Lanka. And how can we approach the express pearl in law of the sea terms? We look at the maritime zone in which this has happened. We look at the flag state jurisdiction. We look at the potential due diligence and responsibility for negligence in the event. We look at all a series of aspects which do create the criminal case. Now, the prosecution office in Sri Lanka is looking into this. The prosecution is going on. But really, the difficulties in maritime cases is how to ensure that there is a compliance with a regulatory framework. Of course, there is a difficulty in building up a regulatory framework. We see it even more beyond national jurisdiction with the entire conversation with the BBNJ and the creation of marine protected areas. But really, when the core business comes, is how to ensure compliance with those regulatory frameworks. And then how to ensure that those major cases, those serious pollution cases, do come under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. Now, jurisdiction of the criminal justice system is activated by cases which are the most serious one. And this goes easily with the concept of due diligence, and this also goes easily with building up the concept of state sovereignty. In the end, when we talk criminal justice, we talk state sovereignty. Of course, we don't look now for the build-up of the ecocides conversation under the ICC jurisdiction, but we look at the sovereign state applying their jurisdiction in their area of competence, whether it is because of coastal maritime jurisdiction or whether it is because of personal, active and passive criminal jurisdiction or flag state criminal jurisdiction. So there are several tools through which we do apply national sovereign criminal jurisdiction on marine pollution offenses. Now, the more we look into building up transboundary movement capacity to ensure compliance through Basel Convention and other tools, the more we will be looking at the maritime space as a dumping option for organized criminal networks. I'm Southern Italian. I've been growing up with the concept of ecomafia. Ecomafias were the ones in which in the 90s were building a business out of waste trafficking. But now the real question is beyond the transboundary movement, which is essential. And so the border authorities' capacity to interdict and control the Basel, interdict and control illicit waste trafficking, and so implement Basel and Bamako Convention and other regional tools and global tools, we need to look also at the maritime space as a dumping space. London Convention, of course, comes to our mind, and London Protocol, but we look at the space, the maritime space, as the location where in the future, as it is also the case now, but mostly and in the long-term perspective, we will see the excessive plastic production being disposed, not only transported, but disposed, because the transboundary movement is a movement which knows the border authorities of country A and country B, departure, arrival, and so also country C, so departure, transit, arrival, knows the carrier, so knows several spots into which the criminal justice system can intervene. But when we look at the sea disposal dumping, we cut a large amount of border controls, we cut a large amount of criminal national jurisdictions, and we see a space in which disposing waste and disposing plastic waste is extremely easy and is extremely difficult to control. If we confront the model of oil pollution think about the bilge water, which is a typology of oil pollution, which has known now many years of criminal jurisdiction implementation through several tools. Oil pollution can be easily, according to some criteria, of course, relative criteria, can be easily spotted. You have an oil spill, you can spot it, and you can maybe identify through several tools the vessel which is in charge of this, which is responsible for this. The question is, how do you actually spot dumping of plastic waste at sea? You probably don't spot it. The time for the operation is so short, and the capacity for residual over the surface are non-existent, that the disposal is extremely easy. And all you have to do is basically pass through the border, called the custom, the border controls of the A country, the country of departure, and then maybe falsify some of the paper trail in order to avoid to identify a B or C country. So it becomes an extremely easy operation. And I'm looking into the dumping model. I'm looking, of course, into flag state criminal jurisdiction mostly, but also we could look into coastal state criminal jurisdiction with some massive limitation, because the UNCLOS was conceived in a period where we were probably prioritizing the economic aspect towards versus the environmental ones. So we have some strong limitation in jurisdiction when it comes to territorial contiguous zone, if at all we could apply this maritime space and EEZ. We have massive limitations which are built into the particular of UNCLOS, but we could still rely on the flag state criminal jurisdiction. And then we need to build up a system in which we can actually we can actually ensure compliance, and not only the regulatory framework. And we can ensure compliance, especially with those criteria for criminal justice jurisdiction related to the most serious cases: large dumping, large transport, or accidental, yes, but due to negligence, large pollution cases. And again, we should probably be studying examples in the build-up of the criminal justice system, like Prestige and Erika, and all the large conversation we had about applying jurisdiction on the maritime space. And again, the Express Pearl is also quite an interesting case to look into, and more specifically related to the plastic framework. I don't know how much time I have. Probably I don't want to exceed my 10 minutes, but let's also look, of course, I've been giving you a brief analysis on the ship source pollution, where intentional or not, where operational or dumping and waste management related. Operational, of course, the MARPOL Convention, but overall, the approach here is limited until now to the 20% of plastic pollution coming potentially from the ship vessel source pollution. And potentially because, as a matter of fact, we can't really analyze how much dumping is currently happening on the maritime space of plastic waste. Again, because disposal is extremely easy, is extremely difficult to detect. It's easy to conduct and difficult to detect. But then the 80% of river source pollution in plastic waste term also can know criminal justice tools, and specifically due to the serious aspect of the environmental violation. And how you get into the river source pollution can happen to be also through criminal justice system, corruption, and one of the massive problems in terms of disposal in the maritime space, because not only you have a compliance issue, you have also the corruption introduction into the mechanism of compliance. But also building up a new legal system based maybe on due diligence. Now, there is an old jurisprudence mechanism from the pulp mills on river relation to maritime pollution, and we look into evolution of due diligence. We look evolution of due diligence into a large amount of soft law, and then jurisprudence tools. Maybe we also look into some aspects related to the ANTOC Convention, the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime for the eco-mafias, and its applicability of Article 11.2 related to the enforcement mandatory jurisdiction for states which know organized crime. And then we look into the due diligence as also a tool to create obligations into member states of the UN mechanism and create obligations into those criminal justice system to maybe prescribe compliance and then also implement through enforcement. Again, the due diligence is a build-up mechanism which goes mostly through jurisprudence and some soft law, mostly, but not uniquely. We need to
Thank you,
consider.
Giuseppe. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so
Okay,
I will ask you to wrap up. Otherwise, poor Anna won't have time to speak in questions. But I think you've coming to the end of what you wanted to say, but very, very important. And I think also linking, these issues are really highly, highly important for consideration in the treaty. Anyway, thank you. I'm going to quickly move on then to Anna, who hopefully hopefully is here to give us, we've heard the problems, we've heard the history. Now, what are potential solutions? What are potential avenues to have a really robust treaty? So just a bit of background, Anna is the founder and CEO of Ocean Vision Legal. It's the first international law firm fully dedicated to marine prevention. Anna and her team use legal action to hold governments and corporations accountable, and while also advancing eco-centric laws that recognize the inherent rights of the ocean. Her work stands out not only for its legal force, but for its grounding in diverse knowledge systems and worldviews, placing humility and justice at the heart of marine governance, something we don't often hear. So Anna, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for this very kind introduction. And I'm very lucky that I come last because we've had so many amazing insights already from Giuseppe and Christina that I'm able now to just piggyback on. So thank you for these amazing introductions. Right. So as Antoinette kindly introduced me, I focus on litigation. I focus on the question, how can we hold states and actors accountable for what they say and what they agree to in international law, so that international law is not only what we call toothless tiger, but becomes something that's enforceable. So today we're going to look, as the last part of the presentation, on the obligations of states to prevent, reduce, and control marine plastic pollution. So we've already heard, and I don't want to go into that therefore, Christina has shown us that plastic pollution is one of the most urgent threats, also for human health, for the ocean, and for marine ecosystems. Yet, the lack of judicial enforcement, as we've heard from Giuseppe, remains one of the major barriers to effective marine protection. And the treaty negotiations are impeded because states can't find a consensus. So what am I going to talk about today? What I find this key message, and I'm already telling you in beforehand here, the result. My key message today is states, as they are preparing for the INC 5.2 negotiations, are already under a legally binding obligation under international law to take measures against plastic pollution and to negotiate this treaty. So there already is a legally binding obligations of states to prevent, reduce, and control plastic pollution, which should really support the adoption of this new treaty. And this is how. We've heard from Giuseppe that the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea was negotiated in a time where especially economic considerations were at the heart. And this is true. But there is one part of UNCLOS which is entirely dedicated, the whole part, to the protection and preservation of the marine environment. And this is part 12 UNCLOS. And its first provision is Article 192. And I know this, like, I'm really trying to strike the balance here, so please hopefully bear with me. I'm trying to show you the law, but make it very applicable. So what I want to tell you beforehand, this is a very big summary, okay? So I'm trying to make this engaging. At the very end of my slides, you're going to find a QR code where everything that I say is summarized together with the jurisprudence, so that you can be very sure that everything that I'm saying here is not just because I say it, but that's really because it's from the law. So you don't need to take notes for this presentation. There will be a policy brief. So let's dive into it. Article 192, UNCLOS, what does it say? States have the obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. Okay, great. There's a second obligation. It's Article 194(1), and it says, states shall take all necessary measures to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment. So I don't know how you feel about this. I find this a little bit abstract. Like, sounds great. But, and now? What do states now specifically have to do? And we're very lucky because we've actually got a really good tool in international law that tells us very, very, very specifically what these obligations mean, particularly when applied to pollution of the marine environment. And that is the jurisprudence of the courts. So while UNCLOS gives us general obligations, then we have the jurisprudence that tells us specifically what this means. And we're very lucky because both of these obligations have been subject to many, many, many cases. So we actually have a very good understanding already what specific obligations are entailed. And here are a few. Firstly, these obligations are legally binding. And thankfully, Giuseppe has already explained to us the difference between primary laws and secondary laws. The primary obligation is that this is a legally binding obligation. And as Giuseppe said, the secondary obligations tells us what happens, what's the consequence. The consequence is that if states fail to meet these obligations, they can be held responsible before international and national courts. Thirdly, this obligation, or both of these obligations, don't only bind the UNCLOS member states, but the entire international community because they are customary international laws. So let's look at this again. States shall take all measures consistent with this convention that are necessary to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment from any source. Let's apply this to plastic. So, is marine plastic pollution, we say pollution, but is this also a pollution under UNCLOS so that it triggers this obligation? Well, UNCLOS has a definition of what marine pollution means, and it is the introduction of substances or energies likely to cause harmful effects. Well, plastic, particularly the standardized forms like polyethylene and polystyrene, forgive me, it's my second language, is a form or matter with a definite chemical composition and consistent properties. So yes, it is a substance. We've heard from Christina, it does have the likelihood, and our likelihood is sufficient, I want to stress, as we can see in this word and the definition. There is a likelihood that it has harmful effects even on humans. So this scientific evidence at the moment is enough to show us that plastic pollution falls within the scope of Article 192 and 194. Okay, breather, because now it's going to get legal. So what is this specific obligation? Article 194 says states must adopt all necessary measures. What's that? Well, again, we're very lucky because also this obligation has been subject to so many cases in international law that we know very, very well what the courts say, what this means specifically. So, mitigation is a central element of this obligation. This means that reducing the plastic production is central in tackling plastic pollution as a mitigation measure, so states have to do that. Secondly, in order to find out what necessary measures states have to adopt, we have to apply a due diligence, which is based on objective and science-based standards, and not just whatever measures states deem necessary. This standard of due diligence must be more stringent the higher the risk and the greater the potential of the actual harm. And we can also use international reports and frameworks or resolutions, such as from the United Nations General Assembly, because very often they are based on the best scientific evidence. And when a great number of states adopts a resolution or a report, it shows us that this is supported by the international community and it has authoritative effect. So, lastly, very importantly, also, we must apply the precautionary approach. This is key in determining what measures are necessary. So let's wrap this up. Let's put this together. What does it mean with regards to plastic? So, firstly, there is a scientific consensus that recognizes marine plastic pollution as one of the greatest threats to the marine environment. That's what the science tells us. Secondly, when we apply the precautionary approach, there doesn't even need to be scientific certainty. It is sufficient that there are high concerns. What we've also seen is, and Giuseppe has cited the Pulpmans on the River case, marine plastic debris is transboundary in nature, triggering the prohibition of transboundary harm, and triggering a hidden standard of the due diligence because it can also harm people outside of the jurisdiction of the harming state. And lastly, as I said, international frameworks and reports and resolutions can also inform what we must do according to the states. Because, as I said, a large number of states have adopted them, so they have some sort of authoritative effect. Well, there are really many United Nations General resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, for example, that say, and please read with me or get that, listen, marine debris in general and plastics in particular were some of the greatest environmental concerns of our time, along with climate change. Excuse me, but I get goosebumps when I read that. Like, this is a statement. And, you know, it goes on. This is just an example. Here's another example. It's a UNODC report that gives some recommendations on what we should do with regards to marine plastic debris. And I want to just reiterate, I know I'm repeating myself, but that, you know, is what the courts say is what inform the content of the obligations of states. So this content is prevention of plastic pollution is a key priority. We need improved governance through long-term solutions, including through a circular economy. Drastic reduction or bans on single-use plastic products are needed. We need a phase out of non-recoverable plastics, such as microplastics and personal care products. This is what's legally binding. These are the standards that if we brought it to court, very likely an international court would say, when I need to see where I should get my information from, I will look at reports such as from the UNEP and see what they recommend. And this is what they recommend. Okay, very last legal point. There are even more legal obligations, not only Article 192 and 194, but also what UNCLOS says, and this is really important. This is why I don't want to skip it, but I've got to keep it brief. What's also in it, it says in section in part 12 UNCLOS, states are obliged to adopt and enforce national laws to comply with this, to prevent, reduce, and control marine pollution. Secondly, through competent international organizations, or diplomatic conferences, and I strongly believe INC5 is such a diplomatic conference, they must establish global and regional rules, such as the Plastic Treaty, that that help to prevent, reduce, and control plastic pollution. So this includes participating, according to the courts, they must participate, meaningfully and in good faith in the INC5 negotiations. And the states are required to make every effort to reach an agreement. So they can't just say, oh, I don't want to today. That's not good enough. So there must be a really meaningful, good faith participation with a real focus on wanting to adopt this treaty. This was also supported by the human rights body. This Human Rights Council resolutions, for example, say that marine plastic pollution jeopardizes the realization of human rights, including the right to a clean, healthy environment, forgive the typo, and it needs an enhanced global cooperation to effectively address this crisis. So again, risking to sounding like a parrot, but states must cooperate. They must go there, and they must cooperate meaningfully with a true view on adopting this treaty. And this is the primary law, to piggyback again on what Giuseppe said. Here's the secondary law. The failure to do so can cause international and national accountability. So states can be held liable in front of domestic and international courts and before human rights bodies. Phew, this was a lot. So just to give you my 5 key summaries at this end. States are obliged to take stringent measures to prevent, reduce, and control marine plastic pollution. This includes the reduction in production, a reduction or ban of single-use plastic, adopting more circular economy, phasing out non-recoverable plastic materials. So this must be there. That's the minimum standard already recognized. States are obliged to adopt and enforce national laws to ensure that their private and public entities conform with this. They are obliged to participate in negotiations such as INC5 and to make every effort to reach an agreement such as the plastic agreement, to adopt international rules to prevent, reduce, and prevent plastic pollution. And if they do not do so, we can hold them liable in front of domestic and international and human rights courts. Thank you. I'm going to leave this slide up for a second because here's a QR code. As I said, I didn't just want to tell you some fact and then go away and pretend that's just the way it is. We've prepared together a policy brief for you where there's the whole jurisprudence, every quote to everything that I just said here, so that you can see it's not just something that I imagined or made up, it is actually what the law says. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. I mean, if that's not clear as glass, what is? We now actually have a way to remind states that they have to approach this in a meaningful way, and that they have obligations, and that there are consequences if not. I think this is very important for member states, for example, who may not have that information to go back to their governments to explain why this is so important for them in order to seek an ambitious plastics treaty. We have literally a few minutes left. I wonder if there are any questions in the chat that anyone has, and if not, let's just see, are there any chats?
Chris
Lauriane?
have a question if she wants to
Okay.
start.
Perfect. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, sorry, I know it's a bit rogue. Hopefully it's allowed. But yeah, it was just prompted by Giuseppe's presentation, but I think it's also a question for Anna as well, maybe. But Giuseppe, you sort of gave an overview about the London Convention, the Basel Convention, and the role that they play. And it was not totally clear to me, like, where you see the gaps in terms of international law that the treaty could fill, particularly when it comes to preventing illegality and dumping within the plastics life cycle. So that's a question for Giuseppe or for Anna. And yeah, maybe Anna, if you have any specific recommendations as well to what people advocating around specific language in the treaty, specific safeguards that can build on the work that you both have been doing, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll leave it to Anna more the point about primary and secondary in state-to-state relations, which is one of the elements Alan was highlighting. What I'm looking at, we work in criminal justice system at state level. We work, I'm based in Libya. I work in the criminal justice system with the criminal justice system of Libya. And so we work with the criminal justice system in many countries all over the world. What we see is actually the capacity to implement already what is there in international law terms at national level. What we see is often the total lack of capacity all over the world to actually implement London Convention provisions about illicit dumping. What we see is the total absence of capacity in regulating, yes, but even more, implementing national legislation where it is present in terms of enforcement on the maritime space. So from our perspective, beyond the development of the international law through treaty or jurisprudence, there is a key absence from states to actually enforce environmental law at sea. And you can see this even if we look beyond the plastic pollution. It's a general trend in maritime environmental law, the absence of capacity to comply, or simply the absence of capacity to, once you regulate the intervention on the maritime space, how you actually go and enforce these regulations. And this becomes a larger problem, even if you look, for example, and I'll be quick in 30 seconds, 20 seconds, the UNCLOS Advisory Opinion 2015 on IUU fishing. It's highly indicative of this psychological trend where you have the due diligence and the monitoring duties over flag states for IUU fishing. But when it comes at the second question, which was raised by the Sub-Regional Fishery Commission for West Africa, which was how you actually enforce this, and specifically how you actually ask for damages. That question was left quite empty by the UNCLOS. So there was a large analysis on the due diligence and a much weaker analysis on the actual enforcement and how this is paid. The key problem in our perspective is that national systems have a big gap in implementing environmental law, specifically on the maritime space, because of an inherent problematic issue with compliance in international environmental maritime law, but also because of national capacity on the second level. I don't know if I addressed your question, but I leave the rest to Anna, which certainly will.
Thank you, Giuseppe. I just want to say very quickly, in general, what I can say, UNCLOS fills the gaps, and that what we've heard are minimum standards. So that should be reflected in the language. This should be minimum standards. And absolutely agreeing with what Giuseppe said. And what I want to stress is that we also need to learn that these obligations are legally binding. But I want to make space for maybe another question. So Lauriane, is there another question in the
It's
audience?
actually more of a comment to complete what you just said about Jérôme Helft. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name. Also, UNCLOS's Article 207(1) on establishing laws to reduce land-based sources of marine pollution. If you want to comment on that, or if Jérôme, you want to complete this with a question, maybe.
No, just making a comment, an additional comment about the existing frameworks. And actually, if we have 1 minute for a question, I wanted to ask maybe Giuseppe or Anna if they see potential impact of the BBNG agreement and the UNCLOS that will be, put into force soon.
Yeah, I mean, BB&J agreement is just something so timely because, as Giuseppe said, UNCLOS was negotiated in a time where economic pressure, economic concerns were at the heart, and BB&J just truly shows a shift in awareness. So while I'm a little bit of a conservative lawyer, I think I already think that UNCLOS already provides amazing obligations to protect and preserve the marine environment. So I think we would actually, if we would start applying UNCLOS, we would be so far ahead already. But BB&J obviously is amazing, let alone because of the language that it uses, which is much more ecocentric than this standard, very anthropogenic laws that we know. It has sections on environmental impact assessments, which are just really crucial and just elevate this to a high standard. There are also big shortcomings as to the applicability and the scope of where it's going to be applied, which is a whole topic in itself. But just in general, yes, of course, BB&J is supporting all of the work that we're doing here and the whole general notion of where we are developing to. And laws are based on ethics, and ethics can be informed by laws. So the development of adopting a BB&J shows that there is a development in the ethics that high seas protections and ocean protection is necessary and needed, and vice versa, when we have laws like BB&J that can implement what we understand of what should be the norm. So I think that's very important.
Thanks. If I
Thank
can
you.
complement 20 seconds. If you look at the OSPAR framework already provides for some MPAs beyond national jurisdiction. And if you speak with the OSPAR management, they will tell you that at the end of the game, implementation and compliance comes with highlighting to flag states about potential violation or members of the same OSPAR. But beyond that, it is always demanded to national sovereignty to implement and enforce. And that's the limitation. And that's also the limitation of the BB&J. The BB&J is a beautiful instrument, is the future in the end. Again, is an ecocentric conception. But the idea is also that in the identification in the future of MPAs, we will need to consider the compliance again, because that may sound like a mantra, which is a mantra from our side. But in the end, BB&J needs to come, and MPAs needs to come with plans for enforcement and compliance. Often, these plans will be left to the flag state. They may also be left to port state, and they may also be left to the national jurisdiction in terms of personal jurisdiction. So the individuals committing the potential offense. But all this is a conversation which is not still enough on the table, and that is how you enforce and comply potential violations specifically for MPAs beyond national jurisdiction. That is basically the science fiction evolution of the law for now and in the future. Over.
If we still have time, I see two questions in the chat. If you're happy to stay for another few minutes, and then another one coming. So from Shima, I hope I'm not butchering your name. Question number 1: what will be the expected rate of ratification of the Plastics Treaty? That's number 1. Number 2: what is the hierarchy that will exist between UNCLOS and the Plastics Treaty? In the case of a judicial dispute, will UNCLOS or the Plastics Treaty apply? And then third one, thank you, Shima, super interesting, how to oblige non-signatory states of the Plastics Treaty in the case of marine pollution. So thank you for all these questions, and then I hope we have you can stay a few more minutes to hear the answers. Thank you. Who wants to go for it?
You could say a statement to the second question. I'm happy to take on the one about what happens if UNCLOS and the Plastic Treaty collide. If can there be an output or already a vision on how many states will, like what the ratification will be?
It's a really interesting question. I think one that's being explored right now because it's actually a very timely question, because there's a discussion about what is the level of ratification that would be necessary in order to have a meaningful impact on tipping the scales of addressing plastic pollution. So, for example, if you would assume, for example, that the US is not going to ratify the instrument, like highly likely, I would say, then what about other global producers of plastics? And that is the kind of very real political situation that we find ourselves in right now. And it's sort of what I alluded to in the presentation. Like, there is a complex geopolitical environment, but what we certainly need is that we need enough. We know there are a set of countries that are likely to ratify the agreement, these 100+ countries, but what percentage of global production and consumption do they represent, and is that meaningful enough? It's clear that we need some global producers and consumers to come on board as part of that ratification process. So I can't answer the question specifically, just to say that it's a very timely and relevant question, that there would be a kind of minimum level that we need to achieve in order for the treaty to be meaningful when it enters into force.
Well, I'm happy to thank you, Chris. That's a really tricky question, and I'm happy to refer to the second question. What happens if the UNCLOS and plastic treaty will collide, or what's the hierarchy between them? Well, so Article 192 UNCLOS is phrased very generally. It's even the heading of it means it says general obligation. And there's a law in UNCLOS, I believe it's Article 237, that says that the provisions of Part 12 must be read in the light of other international laws. So UNCLOS, in its last advisory opinion, the COSAS advisory opinion 2024, said actually those other laws are not lex specialis, which means that they would prevail. They would supersede UNCLOS. They are to be read much more. Article 192 has to be interpreted in the light of these laws. So this means there can't be a collision, because Article 192 provides the baseline, provides a general obligation that is filled through the other obligations. So the other obligations tell us what the content of Article 192 is. Therefore, I was confident to say before, for example, Article 192 says states have the obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. And then there's this international report, and it says, as a minimum standard, states must phase out single-use plastic. And now I can say this informs the content of Article 192, and it might be similar with the plastic treaty, so that UNCLOS and the plastic treaty won't be exclusive to each other, but that the plastic treaty will inform the content of the obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. That would be my interpretation, but that's only my interpretation, so that's not set in stone.
Thank you. And we also have another question, if we have time, and that would be, how can we hold a state accountable for lacking enough minimum standards for enforcing their obligations for the protection of the marine environment and plastic pollution? Even though it's a hard question, but that's what this is for, hard questions.
Okay, can I try that?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So first, we need to take states accountable, make states accountable. I mean, there's no solution than states being accountable, and that's the future. I mean, we cannot have any other tool than, again, sovereign state being accountable. There are several tools. Of course, we have the maritime zones, again, UNCLOS, territorial waters, exclusive economic zone, BBNJ, we go and build up outside the exclusive economic zone. But the question remains, beyond the territorial water jurisdiction and the accountability into these maritime spaces, and so the application of protective principle first, and then preventive principle, all the principles which basically say that your lack of action may impact nearby countries, and so the larger international community. We need also to consider that there is a key to law of the sea and protection of the maritime space. First, getting into the river source pollution, and of course that's integrally territorial the integral territory of the country. It's not a question of jurisdiction, really. It's a question of actually activating national legal frameworks and pointing, finger-pointing due diligence duties over these countries. And again, Anna has been building up the legal argumentation to bring due diligence and duty to enforce, especially easily to apply when it comes to territorial space. But then one of the key aspects is that law of the sea has one major exclusive jurisdiction, and that's the flag state. And so we need to consider how much in the future we can go beyond the current concept of the flag state capacity for monitoring, extremely weak, the existence then of open registries, those registries which are basically not much performing that control duties, and then instead looking into responsibilizing flag states, so that flag states need to realize how much their role into marine pollution may be relevant also in terms of due diligence responsibility, not minor to the importance of the territorial jurisdiction applied by sovereign countries. Maybe Anna wants also to complement on that.
I agree 100% with Giuseppe said, and just in terms of very, like from a litigation lawyer perspective, what I would do, firstly, as I said, these laws, states are obliged to adopt national laws to enforce this. So an individual, a person, could go to a domestic court and sue their government for not doing that. Secondly, this is an international obligation. International law governs the relationship amongst states and between them. So a state could sue another state for not obliging to this. And thirdly, we see human rights bodies expressing their interpretation that pollution of the marine environment would harm the human right to a healthy and clean environment, so that even human rights bodies could be addressed. How this works is a whole different seminar, but happy to give, you can always send an email. And then perhaps to just piggyback on another question that I see here, how to oblige non-signatory states of the Plastics Treaty in the case of marine pollution. This obligation that I talked about, I don't know about the others, but the ones that I talked about, Article 192, UNCLOS, is what we call a customary international law. And there are no objectors to it. This means, translated into normal language, it binds all states universally, regardless if they adopted UNCLOS. So if they didn't adopt UNCLOS, this obligation would still apply to them, and they would still have to comply with this, even if they didn't sign the Plastic Treaty. But it is, of course, another question if you want to sue a state like the US and then have, you know, that's again, you can have a follow-up webinar.
Right.
Do we have time for one very, very final question that just landed in the chat? If we
That will
do,
be the last then.
how can we explain so much plastic in the world despite all these extraordinary legal instruments? That's a very relevant question.
Yeah, if I may say, why don't you ask your own law enforcement agencies? Because in the end, it's to them. Over. I mean, not just to you, Shaima. I'm talking about any law enforcement agency globally.
It's also, I think, the knowledge that people need to know that these instruments exist and to be able to quote them and to use them. These are underutilized or leveraged tools. So I think this is a really important educational webinar and a tool for each country to go out and go further with this. Anyway, we are running out of time. Actually, we went well over time, but it was excellent. And thank you to all the panelists and the audience for some amazing questions, some really interesting information. And let's now see where we go in August, if not before. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And please don't forget that the QR code that Anna had put up, and we'll be sending that to you afterwards on the policy brief. Okay, great. Thanks.
Last comment, we will publish the recording very shortly. So if you've missed anything or if you want to forward this to your colleagues, please feel free to do so. And have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you. And particularly to member states.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Thank you. Bye.